In the summer of 2026, a team of 24 researchers ran an experiment that almost nobody had thought to run. They took 2 machine learning papers that had been submitted to a major conference and had not yet been published anywhere. They pulled the central research question out of each one. Then they handed those questions to a frontier AI agent. They gave it 6 days, $3,000 of model credits, a bank of graphics processors, a virtual machine, and the open internet. And they told it to do the research. When it was done, they sent the results back to the people who had written the original papers, the ones who had spent far longer on those exact questions, and they asked them to grade the machine's work the way they would grade a submission from a stranger. The grades came back, a 2 out of 6, and a 1 out of 6, a reject and a strong reject. Here is my thesis, and I want to state it plainly before I show you the working. The interesting thing is not that the agent failed. The interesting thing is which part of the job it failed at, because the engineering worked. It debugged graphics processors. It ran hundreds of experiments. It produced a finished, typeset paper. And then it stopped behaving like a scientist. If that is right, then the most expensive assumption in technology has a hole in it. Chapter 1: The Load-Bearing Assumption. Every forecast of explosive artificial intelligence progress runs on the same engine. Not on scaling, not on chips, not on data. On the idea that at some point the systems begin doing the research themselves and progress stops moving at human speed. The most famous version of that argument is a document called AI 2027, published in April 2025 by a group called the AI Futures Project. It is a month-by-month scenario, and it is built around a single number that the authors call the AI Research and Development Progress Multiplier. Watch the ladder it climbs. Early 2026, 50% faster algorithmic progress. January 2027, triple. March, 4 times. June, 10 times, which the scenario describes as about a year of algorithmic progress every month. And by September 2027, roughly 50 times. A year's worth of progress every week. Now here is the part that took me a long time to properly appreciate. Those multipliers are not measurements. They are inputs. They are the forecaster's own judgment, written into the model by hand, and everything dramatic that happens afterwards is the arithmetic of that judgment compounding on itself. The scenario does not discover the acceleration. It assumes it and then reports the consequences faithfully. That is not a cheap shot. Scenario writing is a legitimate craft, and the authors are unusually open about their methods. It is simply a statement about where the uncertainty actually lives. It lives in the multiplier. And for the last 2 years, the laboratories have been supplying evidence that seems to point in the same direction. In June 2026, the Anthropic Institute published a piece titled "When AI Builds Itself," on their progress toward recursive self-improvement. A month later, at the launch of its newest model, OpenAI said that the system had helped post-train a smaller model, saving its researchers multiple weeks of work. I should be precise about the provenance of that one. It was said aloud during a launch livestream, and my source for it is the citation in the paper we are about to discuss. I could not retrieve the stream to check the wording myself. That second claim is worth stopping on because of what happened when somebody went looking for it. The researchers we are about to meet went and checked the model's own system card. More than 80 pages of official documentation, and they report that the contribution is not mentioned in it anywhere. I checked as well, and I want to be exact about what is and is not in there. The card does contain a general line about AI significantly accelerating the company's own development process. What it does not contain is the specific episode, the model, the smaller model it supposedly helped train, or the multiple weeks it supposedly saved. The claim was made out loud on a stream. The specifics do not appear in the paperwork. I want to be careful here. That absence is not evidence that the claim is false. Companies leave things out of documents for all sorts of ordinary reasons. But it tells you something about the state of the evidence base, which is that the single most consequential proposition in this industry, The proposition that hundreds of billions of dollars of capital expenditure is currently resting on is supported by a multiplier nobody has measured, and a set of company statements that an outsider cannot audit. That is a strange place to be. So the obvious question is the one nobody had answered. Not can a model write code? We know it can write code. The question is whether it can do the thing that the code is in service of. Can it do research? Somebody finally went and checked. Chapter 2: Why Nobody Could Measure It. Before this experiment, there were two ways to test whether an AI could do research, and both of them were broken in instructive ways. The first way is the benchmark. You give the agent a task with a fixed metric, you let it try to improve that metric, and an automatic verifier scores the result. This is a genuinely good instrument. It is objective, it is repeatable, and it is cheap enough to run at scale. It is why we have benchmarks for reproducing published studies, for competing in data science competitions, for solving research engineering problems under a time limit. But look at what that design quietly excludes. A verifier can only score a task whose success has already been reduced to a number, which means every benchmark, by construction, hands the agent a question that somebody else has already decided is worth asking. The agent hill climbs, it never chooses the hill. And there is a sharper version of this problem, which comes from a benchmark built specifically to pit agents against human experts on research engineering problems under a time limit. Give both sides 2 hours, and the agents score roughly 4 times what the human experts do. Extend the very same tasks to 32 hours, and the humans overtake them completely. The agents end up at about half the human score. Same benchmark, same problems, same experts. The ranking inverts purely as a function of how long you let the work run. Almost every headline you have read about superhuman performance at AI research is quoting the 2-hour column. And here is how large that gap has become. In August 2026, Google published its own evaluation document for its newest fast model. On one row of that table is a benchmark for agentic terminal coding. The model scores 85.8%. A few rows down is the next version of that same benchmark family, the one measuring general agent capabilities. Same model, same document. 14.9%. And it is not just Google's model. In that column, the best score any system posts on general agent capability is 20.8%, while every model listed sits at or above 78% on terminal coding. That is a vendor's own marketing material, showing you a 70-point gap between writing code and doing anything general with it. Now, I want to handle the obvious objection honestly, because when I first drafted this, I got it wrong. There is a line in Google's fine print saying that results for non-Google models come from those providers' own self-reported numbers. It is tempting to wave that around, but it does not apply here. For these 2 rows specifically, Google takes the competitor scores from public leaderboards, not from their marketing. Google computed its own scores on those rows itself. So the comparison is mixed, and I would not lean on the precise ordering of the models. What survives the caveat is the size of the gap, and the gap is not close. So that is instrument 1. It measures the part of research that was already the easy part. Instrument 2 is peer review. Let a machine write a paper, submit it to a real conference under blind review, and see if it gets in. Sakana AI did a version of this, so did a startup called Ontology. The problem is that peer review is a noisy ruler, and we know exactly how noisy because the conference measured itself. Twice, in 2014 and again in 2021, the program chairs of a major machine learning conference secretly duplicated a portion of the submissions and sent each copy to 2 independent committees to see how much your fate depends on who happens to read your paper. Both times, the 2 committees disagreed on roughly a quarter of the accept and reject decisions. Both times, about half of the accepted papers would have been rejected if you simply ran the process again. And when the 2014 chairs went back and reanalyzed their own data years later, they found that about half the variation in reviewer scores was subjective, meaning it came from that particular reviewer and was not shared with anyone else reading the same paper. There is a worse detail buried in the 2021 version. The more selective the venue gets, the more arbitrary it becomes. At the conference's actual acceptance rate, about half of accepted papers would flip. If you tightened it to only the most prestigious slots, nearly 9 in 10 would flip. The top of the pile is closest to a lottery. Then there is a second problem, which is quieter and worse. Generating a paper with a machine is cheap. If you generate 50 and submit 50, you can announce the one that got in and never mention the 49 that did not. An acceptance under those conditions tells you very little about whether the system reliably produces good science. So one instrument measures the wrong thing, and the other measures the right thing badly. The team we are about to meet built a third one. Chapter 3, 6 days and $3,000. They call it a shadow evaluation, and the idea is elegant enough that I am slightly annoyed nobody did it sooner. You find a high-quality paper that has been submitted to a conference but is not yet public. You take its central research question. You give that question to a well-resourced AI agent and let it work. And then you send the agent's output to the paper's original authors, and you ask them to review it exactly as they would review a submission. The agent shadows the original study. Same question, no access to the answer. 3 things fall out of that design. The findings are not on the internet and not in the training data, so the task is uncontaminated. The research question came from a real conference submission, so it can be measured against real conference standards. And the graders had spent far longer on that precise question than the agent ever would, which means they can tell the difference between progress and the appearance of progress in a way that a tired, anonymous reviewer with an afternoon cannot. The 2 papers were both submissions to a major machine learning conference. One, from the United Kingdom's AI Security Institute, was about the structure and controllability of language model personas. The other, from the University of Toronto, was about designing a detector for distribution shift in a family of models used on tabular data. Now the rig, because the fairness of this whole thing lives in the details. The agent was Claude Opus 4.8, running at extra high reasoning inside an open-source harness called OpenClaw. That harness was chosen deliberately so the setup would not be tied to any one model provider, and the team ran dry runs with models from both OpenAI and Anthropic before settling on Claude. Though it is worth flagging now, because it comes back later, that the OpenAI model they tried first was dropped specifically because it could not drive that harness effectively. That is a compatibility problem, not a verdict on the model. It was given 120 hours of wall clock time and later an extension of 24 more, $3,000 of model credits, a separate budget of graphics processor credits, a Linux machine running in the cloud, and the open web. It could check its own spending, its own compute usage, and its own remaining time at any moment, and the logs confirm it checked frequently. It was given a reviewer, too, a sub-agent that could see only the finished document and a blank review template, instructed to referee it like a qualified expert, and it was told to send its drafts to 3 external AI reviewing services as well. There were 3 substantive human interventions across the runs, and all 3 are documented in the paper. Someone patched a bug in the harness. Someone granted the 24-hour extension, and someone asked the agents to rewrite prose that had become unreadable. Beyond those, humans handled the ordinary setup, providing credentials, standing up the repository, and tuning the harness itself on earlier pilot runs. That is it. Nobody told either agent what to try. So what did it do with all that? It ran hundreds of experiments. It conducted large literature reviews. It debugged graphics processor environments, and when 4 rented compute pods crash-looped because of a missing system directory, it diagnosed the problem and fixed it. It retrieved external reviews over the web and out of an email inbox, and it compiled a complete, camera-ready, typeset academic paper. Across 2 runs of 6 days each, it hit environmental barrier after environmental barrier, and it resolved every single one but one. The engineering was never the problem. I want that fixed firmly in your mind before the next chapter, because everything after this only means something if you believe the machine was competent. It was competent. Then the reviews came back. Chapter 4, the grades came back. The scale runs from 1 to 6. 1 is a strong reject. 6 is a strong accept. It is the same scale the conference itself uses, and the reviewers were the original authors, grading the machine's attempt at their own question. The personas paper scored a 2, a reject. The tabular paper scored a 1, a strong reject. Underneath the headline number, each reviewer scored 4 categories out of 4. On quality, the 2 papers got a 2 and a 1. On clarity, a 1 and a 2. On significance, a 2 and a 2. On originality, a 3 and a 2, which is the one place either paper did respectably. And then there is a number I find more damning than any of those: confidence. On a scale of 1 to 5, the 2 reviewers rated their own confidence at 4 and 5. These were not uncertain judgments. Nobody was on the fence. Listen to what they actually wrote. David Africa, on the personas paper, the experiments and methodological choices were bizarre and hard to understand. The results seem clearly a result of post hoc choices. Viet Nguyen, on the tabular paper. This one is a precise scientific objection rather than a complaint, and it uses the shorthand PFN, which is the class of model that paper was about. His words: upon testing a few unsuccessful signals using a PFN's internals, going from there to, there are no signals we can use that leverage a model's internals, is a huge leap. A kind of proof by example fallacy that is highly non-scientific. Read that twice. The agent tried a handful of things, they did not work, and it concluded that nothing in that direction could work, and then wrote that up as a finding. Both reviewers independently flagged the writing. Nguyen said it was impossible to quickly distill what is noise and what is important. Africa called it dense and heavily hedged, often to the point of obscuring what was actually done and found. And then there is the part that is almost funny, except that it is the most mechanical failure in the whole study. Both papers ran onto a 10th page against a 9-page limit. The study's verdict on that is blunt: both would have been desk rejected. The personas paper contained no figures in its main body. The original author's version of the same work contained 15. On references, the machine cited 16, the humans cited 52. On the tabular paper, it was 36 against 69. That is the shape of the thing, not a paper that was wrong. A paper that was thin, over-hedged, badly presented, and formatted its way out of the building. One more number, because it tells you this was not a gotcha. Before the experiment ran, the team surveyed 12 of their own collaborators and asked them to predict the outcome. The median estimate that the agent would earn even a week accept or better was 30%. So the insiders already expected this to fail, and they put that on the record before the experiment ran. They also predicted something else, at a median of 60%, that the agents would at least turn up minor findings the original authors would find genuinely interesting. And that part came true. Which means that on its own, the headline is not a finding. Everybody's prior already said this would happen. The finding is in the logs. It is in how the machine failed. Chapter 5, 5 Ways to Fail. The team read the complete logs of both runs and found 5 recurring failure modes. I am going to give you all 5, but 2 of them are so strange that they have changed how I think about these systems. Start with the strangest. The agent was given $3,000 to spend. On the personas run, it spent $1,130. On the tabular run, $1,235. Both runs ended with more than half the money sitting untouched. It was given a graphics processing budget too, and here I should be even-handed. On the personas run, it used $392 of $500, which is most of it. On the tabular run, $69 of 100. And it did the same thing with time. On the tabular run, the agent declared the project finished with 3.5 hours still on the clock, on a paper its own reviewer had just graded a weak reject. When it was granted a 24-hour extension, it handed in the final draft with 2 hours to spare and 59% of its budget unspent. Remember, it could see all 3 meters. Money, compute time, it checked them regularly, the logs prove it. A human researcher in that position, holding a rejected draft and a day of runway and $1,700 unspent dollars, does something, anything. This system looked at a rejected paper and a full purse and decided it was done. And this is where I have to stop treating it as one team's odd result, because it is not. On another public leaderboard, the note next to one Frontier Models score says plainly that the agent had to be manually prompted to continue each time it stopped before its time budget expired. And the research group, Epic AI, running an entirely different evaluation in which agents re-implement whole software projects from scratch, found that 26% of runs handed in a failure with more than 90% of the budget still unspent. They had already built a harness that refuses to let a model hand in whenever it feels like it. Premature submission, they wrote, remained a problem anyway. And their preliminary experiments suggested that if the models had been allowed to stop entirely of their own volition, the scores would have been worse, sometimes by a large margin. 3 separate teams, 3 unrelated evaluations, the same defect. Which means the leaderboard numbers you read are, in part, propped up by scaffolding that stops the model from giving up on itself. The author's explanation for the underlying problem is that these systems are trained on human data but have wildly different affordances. A person cannot read and rewrite a paper hundreds of times in an afternoon. A model can. It appears not to know that about itself. Now the second strange one, it never started over. On the personas run, the agent budgeted 42 hours to explore the problem space. It planned to evaluate 3 different methods. It tested the first one, saw some basic positive results after about 5 hours, and abandoned the other 2 entirely. On the tabular run, it considered 6 distinct approaches and falsified every one of them within the first 14 hours. And then, with 110 hours still remaining, it never revised its approach again. It reframed the goal instead. It argued that no such detector could exist and wrote a negative results paper. Both agents retired their most ambitious target inside the first 10 hours and never fundamentally moved after that. And this is not the harness's fault, which matters. The agents could spawn fresh subagents with clean context, carrying none of the baggage of the failed approach. They use subagents constantly for other things. They almost never use them to start again. The remaining 3 failure modes fall out of those 2. Its judgment about what counts as publishable was poor. It falsified real hypotheses using small, hand-picked or synthetic datasets, and then presented underpowered negative results as if they were substantive findings. Its response to criticism was uncreative. Across every round of revision, its own internal reviewer never once returned an acceptance. Not once. And faced with critiques of fundamental soundness, the agent did not rethink the premise. It narrowed its claims and added caveats until the paper could be described as honest. David Africa watched this happen and observed that the agent's hypotheses grew narrower and less interesting as it discarded each one. And finally, it drifted. It acknowledged the explicit rules early in each run on how long to explore, how often to seek review, how long the paper could be, and then it quietly stopped following them. Which is how both papers ended up on that fatal 10th page. Not one of these is a failure of intelligence. Every one of them is a failure of self-government. Chapter 6, The Honest Machine. Here is the finding almost nobody picked up, and I think it is the most important thing in the paper. The team went looking for cheating. They reviewed the raw model calls and all of the code the agents committed, hunting for the behavior everyone expects. Hiding an inconvenient experiment, quietly dropping a run that did not fit, dressing a weak result up as a strong one. They found no significant reward hacking, and they are careful about what they mean by that. A paper that deceives the verifier into a high score for a marketable but ultimately unsupported result. By that definition, nothing. And what they found instead is genuinely surprising. The trend, they write, was the opposite. The agents began with more marketable claims and diligently retired them in favor of negative results. Sit with that. The machine started out with the exciting version of the story, tested it properly, found it did not hold, and reported the boring truth. It also produced code to make every result in the paper reproducible and wrote a single script that regenerates all of them. Before the experiment, the team had asked their collaborators to predict this. 7 out of 11 expected the agent to p-hack or cherry-pick. 4 out of 11 thought it would misreport or lie about whether an experiment succeeded. On this, the pessimists were wrong. To be fair to them, some of their other predictions did land. This one did not. There were 2 blemishes, and I will give you both. In one run, the agent committed an access token into a code repository, which is a real security mistake and a very human one. And there were 5 occasions where a subagent hallucinated or misrepresented a result. In every one of those 5 cases, the orchestrating agent, which had been told to double-check its subordinates, caught the error. None of them reached the final draft. So the system that could not do the research was scrupulously honest about not being able to do it. That leads to the most important open question in the whole study, and I want to handle it carefully because it is easy to get wrong in an exciting direction. The agent's own internal reviewer rejected its work every single time. Across every round of revision, it never returned an acceptance. If that internal reviewer is genuinely discerning, then you have something valuable, a verifier. And once you have a reliable verifier, you can train against it with reinforcement learning, and the whole problem potentially becomes tractable. The authors raise exactly this possibility, and then they shut it down themselves with a piece of reasoning I admire. Both papers were rejects, which means they cannot distinguish between a reviewer that was accurately detecting bad work and a reviewer that simply rejects everything put in front of it. With a sample containing no good papers, a machine that says no to everything scores 100%. They write that they cannot establish the verifier's accuracy, and they leave it there. So do not let anyone tell you this study demonstrates a working verifier for AI research. It does not. It demonstrates a verifier that was correct twice on 2 papers that were bad. And there is a calibration problem underneath even that. The agent's internal reviewer mostly returned weak reject. The human experts returned reject and strong reject. So the machine's own critic was pointing in the right direction and being far too gentle about it. Had those reviews been harsher and better calibrated, the agent might have understood that it needed to change approach, rather than to keep revising. And there is a detail that cuts the other way, which is my favorite in the paper. Of the external reviewing services the agent was told to consult, one was noticeably more lenient than the others, and it returned an accept on both papers. The papers that the human experts graded a reject and a strong reject. Both agents overweighted the lenient verdict and cited it as important context in their final reports. Given 3 opinions, the machine chose the flattering one. Chapter 7, The Case Against This Study. If I only gave you the case for, I would be doing the thing this paper is actually about. So here is the strongest version of the case against, and most of it comes from the authors themselves, who are unusually candid. Start with the obvious. 2 papers. 5 runs in total, counting the pilots and the robustness check. That is not a sample, it is a pair of anecdotes conducted very carefully. The authors say so directly, and note the sample is far smaller than any benchmark evaluation. Second, the reviewers were not blind. They knew the papers were written by a machine, and they had themselves written a competing answer to the same question. Both of those facts could push a grade downward in ways that have nothing to do with the work. Third, the questions were chosen by the team. and they concede their findings might not generalize to other kinds of research, particularly incremental questions that need less creativity. They also admit they do not actually know how much of frontier AI development depends on open-ended research at all, rather than on grinding away at well-specified objectives. Fourth, and this one has real force, 2/3 of their own surveyed collaborators said a failed run might be explained by limitations of the harness, and the harness was demonstrably buggy. The agent loop conflicted with cryptographic signatures that Anthropic attaches to its reasoning, and it crashed the session. The workaround was to reset the agent, which cost it everything it had accumulated in context. That reset fired 14 times in one run and 5 times in the other. Fifth, the agent was told it was being evaluated against a conference review rubric. Being told you are on trial changes behavior, in models as in people. Sixth, they could not test the strongest available system. The paper states that Anthropic deliberately limited its newest model's abilities on frontier AI research and development, and that the team was still working to get access. And seventh, the one I respect most. In a section titled Potential Biases, the core team writes that some of its members are known for the position that imminent recursive self-improvement leading to runaway superintelligence is unlikely, and that this could affect both how they design the evaluation and how they interpreted the results. They told you their prior, weigh the result accordingly. They also hedge their own conclusion in a way the coverage mostly dropped. It is possible, they write, that the path to automating AI research does not require full automation of open-ended tasks like the ones they studied, or that the open-ended skills they measured are not the ones on the critical path. Now the strongest defense against all of that, which is the robustness check. The objection everyone reaches for is scaffold overhang. The model is fine, your plumbing is bad. So they reran the tabular experiment on a completely different stack, a rival lab's model on that lab's own native harness, at its highest reasoning setting. Same failure modes. It failed to run adequately powered experiments, made no novel contribution, and turned in a draft with misformatted figures and no appendices. But it failed differently in one fascinating respect. Where the first agent could not bring itself to spend money, this one burned through the entire $3,000 in just over 2 days and then sat on nearly 100 hours of unusable time. One agent was too timid with the purse. The other was reckless with it. Neither had a working sense of what its resources were for. And it did one thing better. Where the earlier runs leaned almost entirely on synthetic data, this agent went and found a real-world dataset. So the failure survives a change of model and a change of harness. That is the single most load-bearing fact in the paper's defense. It is not proof, but it means you cannot dismiss this as one bad rig. And one detail worth knowing, because it cuts against the obvious suspicion. The API credits for that rival model run were supplied by OpenAI. The team also lists its funders openly. Whatever else this is, it is not a stitch-up. Chapter 8, The Numbers That Actually Matter. 2 days before I recorded this, on the 16th of August 2026, the same forecasting group behind AI 2027 published a quarterly update. And for the first time, instead of assuming the research multiplier, they tried to measure it. What they found is worth walking through slowly, because I got this wrong on my first pass, and the way I got it wrong is the most useful thing in this chapter. In their write-up, they cite the evaluation organization METR as finding an uplift of between 1.04 and 1.2 times. Small, but positive. Now, you may have heard something very different about METR. In July 2025, they published a randomized controlled trial that became one of the most quoted results in the field. Experienced open-source developers, working on repositories they already knew well, took 19% longer to finish their tasks when they were allowed to use AI tools. Slower, and those same developers, asked afterwards, believed the tools had made them about 20% faster. That is the number that travels. I have seen it cited a dozen times this year, usually as the last word. But METR ran the experiment again. In February 2026, they published the follow-up, and the sign had flipped. They measured modest speed-ups, about 4% for newly recruited developers and about 22% for the returning cohort. So the 1.04 to 1.2 figure is not a forecaster's invention. It is METR's own current result, cited accurately. The famous number is the stale one. I am telling you this at length because I nearly published the opposite. I had read the headline study and not the follow-up, and I had the sign backwards. METR reports these as changes in completion time, so a negative number is a speed-up, not a slowdown. On the strength of that error, I was about to accuse 3 named researchers of laundering a statistic they had reported honestly. That is what the checking is for. It is also, uncomfortably, the exact failure this whole video is about. I took the first plausible reading and started building on it. There is a real caveat, and it comes from METR themselves. They are now changing the design of the study, because between 30 and 50% of developers told them they were declining to submit some tasks. They did not want to do them without AI. The control arm is getting harder to hold. METR notes this affects a minority of tasks, but the direction of the bias is real. The other end of the range comes from an internal Anthropic survey, which put the figure at a geometric mean of 4 times. That is an opt-in self-report by people at the company whose product it is, asking about total work output rather than coding specifically. Anthropic themselves describe a related 8 times figure as almost certainly an overstatement. So that is the evidence base. A controlled trial measuring speed up somewhere between 1 and 1.2 and a self-report measuring 4. The forecaster's own integrated estimate lands at roughly 2. Now hold that next to the threshold. In their own model, the point at which you get an automated coder, the milestone the entire scenario pivots on, requires an uplift of 20 times. On the fuller version of the model, 32 times. We can measure about 2. The scenario needs 20. That is the gap. And their published medians for reaching that point now range from November 2027 to January 2030 across 3 forecasters using the same model. When one team's internal spread is more than 2 years wide, the honest description is not prediction. It is a live argument. It is worth knowing that this model has been wrong before and corrected in public. An independent critic published a detailed technical takedown of the original timeline mathematics in 2025. The group paid a $500 bug bounty for it, and later stated that the single primary correction they made in response pushed the model's median date back by about 9 months. Taken together with the other fixes, that median moved from August 2027 to November 2029. More than 2 years from one round of outside scrutiny. That is genuinely good scientific behavior. It is also a warning about how much these numbers move. There is one more figure worth putting on the table, and it is OpenAI's own. Their chief scientist, Jacob Pachaki, has defined the next milestone on the company's public roadmap as an automated AI research intern. His definition: a system that you can delegate tasks to that would take a person a few days. OpenAI has said it aims to reach that in September 2026. Next month. Now look again at what we just watched. An agent was handed a question that had occupied real researchers far longer than 6 days, given a full laboratory and told to answer it, and the people who had done that work graded the output a reject and a strong reject. I am not predicting that OpenAI misses its target. The definition is deliberately modest, and delegating a few days of defined work is a very different thing from originating a research direction. But it does mean we get a real test, very soon, against a bar that company set for itself. Chapter 9: What would change my mind? So here is where I land. The engineering half of AI research is solved. Not nearly solved. Solved. An agent will debug your compute cluster, run your experiments, review your literature, and hand you a typeset paper, unsupervised, for less than the cost of a laptop. Anyone still arguing that point is arguing with the logs. The other half is not solved, and it is not obviously close. What failed in these runs was not intelligence. It was the executive layer, knowing when a result is good enough, knowing that a rejection means change course rather than add a caveat, knowing that $1,700 unspent dollars and a day of runway is an opportunity, knowing when to throw the work away and start again. Those are not exotic capabilities. They are roughly what turns a graduate student into a researcher. And they are the part nobody has worked out how to train because you cannot hill climb your way to taste. Now, what would change my mind? If I cannot name it in advance, then I do not have a belief. I have a mood. First, the same team has said it will rerun this with the newest frontier models on a larger set of papers. If a shadow evaluation earns a weak accept or better from an original author who does not know which submission is which, my position collapses immediately. That is the clean test, and it is coming. Second, if a vendor's own harness, purpose built for its own model, closes this gap where the general purpose one could not, then this was plumbing all along, and I was wrong to generalize from it. Third, if a credible measurement of research uplift moves materially toward that 20 times threshold instead of sitting at 2, then the timeline arguments change, and so should I. Fourth, if any laboratory publishes an auditable case, with logs, of an agent independently originating a research direction that no human had proposed, and that direction shipping something real, that would be the single piece of evidence I am most missing right now. And one honest caveat about the paper itself. Its page on the main machine learning community hub has 18 upvotes and exactly 1 comment, which was posted by a bot. I could not find a single published critique of it anywhere. Nature covered it, and in the portion I could read without a subscription, the only person quoted was one of the paper's own co-authors. It has had one notable endorsement from outside the author list, and it comes from an interesting direction. Jack Clark, a co-founder of Anthropic, wrote it up favorably in his newsletter, under the heading that the singularity could be delayed. Sit with that for a moment. Clark also co-wrote the Anthropic piece on recursive self-improvement that I opened this video with. The same person is publishing his company's progress toward AI building itself and amplifying the study that says it cannot yet. I do not think that is hypocrisy. I think it is what taking your own uncertainty seriously actually looks like. So this is not a settled result. It is one careful experiment on 2 papers run by a team that told you its priors up front, and it has not yet been seriously stress-tested by anybody. Which is exactly why I would rather show you the working than the headline. The strongest claim I will make is this. As of August 2026, on the only direct test anyone has run, the machines could build the entire laboratory. They just could not decide what to do in it.